While economies across the globe are still recovering from the debt that COVID landed us in, you start to wonder, where does money actually come from? How is it created? Should CEOs be paid as much as they are paid? Should they be paid more? Those questions have sat front and centre in the mind of Paul Sheard, an Australian-American economist and senior research fellow at Harvard's Business School. He joins us now to discuss his new book, The Power of Money. Paul, welcome to the show. Great to have you on. I've got to say, I was reading the book last night. It's endorsed by Klaus Schwab and Kevin Rudd. So, I mean, we can start off from there, kick it away. Where does money come from, Paul?
Well, thanks very much for having me on, Rowan. Well, I wrote this book after about 20 odd years in the financial markets, and I realized that a lot of people, even in the financial markets, don't actually understand where money comes from. Now, of course, most people would say, well, it pops into my paycheck, but, where did the company that paid you, pardon me, get the money from? And when you go back to really fundamentals, you realize that money comes into this system in two basically sort of complementary ways. One is through the banking system. Banks create money when they lend. That's how money gets into circulation via that route. And the other one, which is a little bit more counterintuitive, is that governments create money, and that money comes into the economy when they run budget deficits, because a budget deficit just means the government is writing more checks into the economy than it's taking out in taxation. So there's two ways that money comes into existence. And, that does matter for policy questions, issues about how big should the government be, how big should the role of the government be in getting that money into the system.
James.
Well, I'm really interested in this whole question. I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic that has almost philosophical implications to it. We saw this huge wave of money pour into the economy, be created out of nothing, essentially, for COVID. Now the money supply is being turned off in the United States a bit. But I want to ask you about a new way money could be created, and that's digital currencies, because we talk a lot about this on this show. And I know that, Rowan mentioned Klaus Schwab. I've seen people at the WEF suggesting that with a digital currency, your money and your ability to spend can be turned on and off like a tap. This doesn't sound like something a lot of people would be in favor of, surely.
That's a great question, James. And, most money, when we think about it today, is already digital. Most of the money that you or I have or anybody has is some kind of a claim on the banking system, money in your bank account. Banks themselves hold digital money at the central bank, the Reserve Bank of Australia, for example, in this country. So most money is digital. But what you're talking about, James, of course, is these new cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and there's probably about 20,000 of them out there.
Well, and one's created by federal banks. Yeah. And one created by reserve banks.
So exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so the cryptocurrencies, which sit on this new technology, the blockchain, is a very exciting new development. Sits outside of what I would call the sovereign monetary system that I described in the introduction. Now, what's happened is there's been a wake-up call to central banks all around the world that they realized that they were sort of having their thunder stolen potentially by these new crypto exchanges and cryptocurrencies. They're now getting into it themselves with what is called central bank digital currencies. And a few of these have been launched around the world. But one way to think about this would be you have dollars are banknotes going a little bit out of fashion these days. But the idea is that the general public might be able to hold a kind of digital version of that rather than their digital money being a claim on the banking system. But you rightly point out that this is actually potentially becoming a very contentious issue politically, because you have a thing called programmable money potentially, where if the digital currency was issued by the government, and with the emerging technologies we have these days, you could have quite a big role for the so-called surveillance state. And you might find yourself having your money turned on or off, potentially, depending on, whether your expenditures, your spending was past muster or not. So this is rapidly turning into a politically contentious issue.
Well, Paul, what do you feel about that? Because that would give governments the ability to institute a social credit system of sorts. If you behave in a way they don't approve of, if you don't have your COVID boosters, or if your emissions are too much, or you're posting stuff on social media you shouldn't be, there could be a punishment. Or I know we're looking, well down the track, but we've seen China employ a social credit system, and we got a taste of it through those COVID years where people were restricted, their freedoms and liberties were restricted according to their vaccination status, for example.
Well, in a nutshell, I'd be quite concerned. I think this debate needs to be had. We don't want cancel culture coming to money, which effectively I think is what you're kind of touching on there, Rita. And we've already seen a bit of a sniff of this, in recent times in different guises. Once governments have the ability to do things, unless there are checks and balances on that, sooner or later, some actors with less, maybe with slightly nefarious kind of viewpoints will start to use the technology. So I think as we do move to this digital currency kind of a central bank digital currency world, we need to have a very careful debate. And I think one way to deal with it, Rita, is to make sure that there are other options around. I'm a person who walks around with quite a bit of cash in my wallet still.
Good man, good man.
A little bit of an anachronism.
Excellent. That's what I've been doing, Paul. Good to hear it. I'm going to quote from an article in the Financial Review, which I think was taken from your book, where you say, but here's a radical thought. Perhaps top management, you're talking about CEOs, should be paid more under the stakeholder capitalism model, given that they need more knowledge and skill, in other words, to deal with all the woke stuff like climate change and whatever else, and are subject to even more pressure and stress than under the share, because they've got to have transgender people on the board or whatever it is, than under the shareholder primacy model. Now, just very quickly, you see, I'm not a fan of this whole stakeholder thing. I think it's a Ponzi scheme. And there are plenty of people who agree with me. The Daily Telegraph in the UK are saying that the ESG movement is a dangerous con. Tell us about why you think the shareholder model is of the past and the stakeholder model is what we're moving into.
Yeah, and that comment, Rowan, was a tiny bit tongue-in-cheek.
Good,
but I was really
excellent.
out the fact that
Love comedy and books, that's good.
I'm not here to campaign for higher CEO pay, but what I point out in this chapter in the book is that rising inequality, and part of that is the high compensation that CEOs get, is the sort of flip side of the system generating prosperity. So people get very, very rich, usually because they're doing something useful for society. So you don't want to kind of kill the messenger. But I was pointing out there that under the stakeholder sort of maximization model, which just kind of has been the foundation, the cornerstone of our sort of capitalist market economy, there's a little bit of a kind of a mismatch between the way that individuals perceive executive compensation and its role at the economy level, because essentially executives are representing shareholders. And JP Morgan is a case I cite, something like $480 billion of market cap. Amazon is $1.4 trillion of market cap. So there's an awful lot at stake that CEOs are held responsible for in managing stewardship, if you like, of these important corporate assets. Now, my tongue-in-cheek point was to say, well, if you with the stakeholder model, Rowan, the obligation to shareholders doesn't go away. It's just kind of added to with a whole bunch of new stakeholders. And the tongue-in-cheek comment was to say, well, you're asking CEOs to do their normal job, plus become experts on climate change, on all sorts of social issues, and you're really giving them a pretty difficult job description, and maybe that needs to be compensated.
And so just very quickly before we go, Paul, do you think the stakeholder model, this is the idea that companies have an obligation to climate and transgender and diversity and all that stuff, do you think that has had its day, or do you think it's going to get worse?
I think probably, Rowan, the pendulum is starting to swing back a little bit, certainly in the US. And, I'm a little bit, to sort of declare my own colours, perhaps a little bit more in line with Milton Friedman in his famous article, I think back in 1970 or so, where he said, we don't really want to overburden management with all of these issues. A lot of these issues really belong in the political sphere, and they should be debated and resolved there.
Paul Sheard, great to chat to you. And The Power of Money, that's your book there up on the screen. I'm just jealous because I keep asking Klaus Schwab and Kevin Rudd to autograph my book, to sign my book, and they keep refusing. Maybe you can help me out there in the future, Paul. Great to chat to you. Thanks so much for coming on. And you can find Paul's book there and learn all about money, who it belongs to and who it doesn't.